Welcome back, guys. We have now finished our desert animal adaptations and we are moving into desert plants. Plants that are adapted to the desert are some of the most adapted, specialized organisms in all the world. So it's pretty cool to be able to look at these. And I'm breaking it up into 2 weeks. We're going to look first this week at succulents. And I'm going to talk to you about what that is. They're different than the other plants that you see in the desert. And then next week we're going to focus on trees, shrubs, grasses, and annuals. So they kind of have some different mechanisms to be able to survive in the desert. But this week we're going to look at succulents, and those are cacti. All of the cacti are succulents, and then some other plants like agave, aloe, etc., things like that. So we're going to look first overall at limiting factors for plants in the desert. Very similar to the limiting factors that we had for animals, but plants are much more tied to water. Animals obviously tied to water too, but animals also affected greatly by the extreme heat. Plants not as much focused with the heat, but more lack of water and the fact that the sun is then pulling water out of them, so dehydrating them. So the biggest factor for plants is the lack of water. So we're going to look at different ways to get around that lack of water, and then also look at some adaptations that have to do with avoiding the extreme heat as well. So plants that are adapted to live in an arid environment are what we call drought-adapted plants, are called xerophytes. Okay, you hear about when you're landscaping down here in Phoenix, in the desert, whatever, you're talking about xeriscaping your landscaping so that you don't have to use much water to water it. And that's what they're talking about, is using xerophyte plants in order to have plants that are drought tolerant, and therefore you don't have to be using a lot of water. Given that we have water shortages here in Phoenix, it's good not to have to water your lawn, etc. down here. So all of these xerophytes have adaptations that allow them to survive in extremely hot, very dry periods in the summer. We all who have experienced the summer here in Phoenix know that that's what we have, very hot, very dry periods, and these plants have adapted different ways to be able to survive during that time. So we have 3 options for desert living, just as we had 3 options with animals. Okay, now we have 3 options for plants. And what we're going to look at this week is succulents, which basically succulents is plants being able to store water. So similar to the Gila monsters and the chuckwallas, etc., that we looked at in the animals, these plants have tissues within their body that are able to store water, hold on to that water, and then able to use that water during real severe drought times where they don't actually have to have external water. They can use the water that's stored within them. The second mechanism is what we call drought tolerance. Okay, so we looked at heat tolerance in animals. Now we're looking at drought tolerance in plants, where they have adaptations to be able to conserve water and to basically withstand the drought, so get through those drought periods. We'll talk a little bit about that this week, but mostly we're going to be talking about drought-tolerant plants in the trees and shrubs, etc. next week. And then we're going to talk about drought avoidance. So avoiding it altogether, we talked about that with animals that perhaps migrate out of the desert during the summer, or spend most of their year in a burrow underneath the ground, avoiding the drought and the heat. Well, we have plants that avoid drought altogether as well, and those are generally our annuals. So these plants actually exist as seeds, can exist as seeds for decades until water stimulates germination. So when they get a lot of water going, those seeds suddenly germinate, they grow really quickly, they breed, produce seeds again, and die off. So very easily avoiding the really, really dry times. And we're going to talk about those annuals and other drought avoiders next week in our lecture next week, in week of 11. So back to succulents. So we're talking about succulents. Succulents is performed by succulent plants. Okay, so they are called succulent. Succulents is the actual act of storing the water. So the plants that we're talking about this week are water storers as well as water guarders. So not only are they storing this water, but they are very closely protecting it and using it very, very carefully. So succulent plants have generally thick, fleshy bodies. If you think about cacti, you think about those thick, fleshy bodies. They have very, very thick skins, etc. They have tissues within them that are actually mucilaginous that allow them to store that water inside them. They have very waxy cuticles on the outside of them, waxy coating, basically covering their bodies so that they are not losing any water through their skins other than potentially through those stomates. Stomates, remember, are the openings in the leaves or stems, wherever they may be, that allow carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. The only place that plants want to lose water is through those stomates when those stomates are open. Plants want to be able to control when those stomates are open so that they can control when those stomates are losing water, and basically that way they can conserve their water. So they have this waxy cuticle covering the whole surface of the plant other than the stomates to keep water from coming out anywhere else. Most desert plants, if they have leaves, they don't have a lot of leaves. They have few leaves. And controlling the number of leaves actually allows them to control the amount of surface area that they have. The less surface area they have exposed to the sun, the less likely they are to lose water. So that's a water conservation mechanism by having few leaves, decreasing surface area. Cacti do not have leaves at all. Spines are actually modified leaves, but they don't serve a leaf purpose. They have no true leaves, and they actually photosynthesize through their stems instead of leaves. And that really decreases the surface area that they have exposed to be able to lose water through. So obviously cacti also have spines. We're going to talk about spines and why spines are important. I just moved down here to the desert about 2 years ago, and what I'm finding out is that every single plant almost here in the desert, living even in my yard, has spines on it. Everything, even the weeds. I go to pull a weed and ouch, hurts my hand. Everything is protected with spines. It's pretty crazy. You don't see that up north at all. So we will talk about that. Spines are obviously for protection from herbivores. Herbivores are organisms that eat plants. Okay, so obviously all the animals living in the desert are also very thirsty, and so if they think that they can get the water from these succulent plants, then they would potentially eat them. So they have spines to protect them from those herbivores. Spines also shade the stem, interestingly, so when the sun is at a certain angle, you're actually going to get a shadow from those spines on the stem of the plant, which allows them to stay cooler and keep those stem temperatures lower. One big adaptation that is performed by many of our desert plants, particularly our succulents, is something called CAM photosynthesis, crassulacean acid metabolism photosynthesis. I know that's a big word. We just call it CAM photosynthesis for short. But CAM photosynthesis is specialized for water conservation in particular. Cacti and other succulents use this CAM photosynthesis, and basically if you think back to normal photosynthesis, you have your stomates open, allowing for carbon dioxide to come in, oxygen to come out, and it's going through its light cycles during the day when it can get sun, and then it's conducting its Calvin cycle whenever. It doesn't really matter. There's no separation of events happening in normal photosynthesis. During CAM photosynthesis, the stomata, those openings in the surface of the plant that allow carbon dioxide in and oxygen out, as well as letting some water out, are closed during the day. They're only open at night. So CAM plants bring in their carbon dioxide at night. Obviously, it's cooler at night. There's no sun heating those plants up. Therefore, there's very little water coming out of those stomates when they have them open at night. They're completely closed during the day to avoid having water sucked out of those plants during the day. So what they do instead, they basically store their carbon dioxide. Generally, in normal C3 photosynthesizing plants, normal plants for photosynthesis, they aren't storing their carbon dioxide. They're using it right away. It's coming in whenever it's needed. They're using it right away to turn into glucose. In CAM photosynthesis, they're actually storing carbon dioxide at night as it comes in through the open stomata. And then during the day when the stomata are closed, they have the stored carbon dioxide in another form that can be made into glucose without needing to pull in more carbon dioxide at the same time. So during the day when the stomata are closed, the carbon dioxide that was turned into a different 4-carbon acid overnight, it releases its carbon dioxide to the dark reactions, and the plant can then make glucose during the day without having to have its stomates open during the day. So water conservation, huge, because it allows the plant to only have its stomates open when it's cooler and less likely to lose water. So I've just put a diagram on here. You can see carbon dioxide is stored at night. You can see it coming into this cycle here. It's stored as an organic acid, and then during the day it's turned back into carbon dioxide and goes ahead and goes through the Calvin cycle just like normal and produces the glucose, but it's from that carbon dioxide that was stored overnight. So that's pretty interesting. The one thing about CAM photosynthesis is that it is less efficient. You can't be doing it all the time. It's less efficient than normal C3 photosynthesis, and therefore plants that have adopted CAM photosynthesis as a water storage mechanism grow slower. They can't grow as fast. So you see cactuses grow very, very slow. Saguaro cactuses, they take about 50 to 75 years to grow an arm on them. In the first years, they grow maybe like 1.5 inches a year. So very, very slow growing organisms because of this need for CAM photosynthesis. There are a few plants that actually can switch back and forth between CAM photosynthesis and regular C3 photosynthesis when water is present, but that is pretty rare. So. All right, let's talk about some specific plants. We know that most succulents in the desert all have similar adaptations, but there are some particular adaptations in different plants that are somewhat different. So that's kind of what I'm going to demonstrate for you today, is some of those unique qualities about some of these plants that are different than you see in kind of every other succulent plant. So first we're looking at the pancake prickly pear cactus. You see these all over, very common here in the Sonoran Desert. This pancake prickly pear cactus, as I said, is a stem succulent. So it stores water in its stem. I said that cacti do not have leaves, okay? So obviously cacti are going to be stem succulents storing water in their stems, and you can see the pads on this prickly pear cactus are actually the stem for this cactus. So we are using CAM photosynthesis in this plant. There are no leaves, so it's photosynthesizing through its green stems, not the leaves. A normal non-desert plant would be photosynthesizing through its leaves generally. It has spines, as I said, which are those modified leaves protecting it from herbivores and also shading that plant to reduce water loss from the sun. And those spines also provide insulation from the wind. Okay, so within those spines, often they're very densely packed spines, and within those spines, it actually provides an insulating layer of still air around that plant that insulates it from transpiration as well as from the heat of the sun. So that insulating air basically keeps the plant from heating up as much, as well as protecting it from the wind, and so there's no wind running past those plant surfaces to pull more water off of that plant. Continued with the prickly pear cactus. Prickly pear cactus is very drought tolerant, okay? Interestingly, this is one that is very, very drought tolerant as a cactus goes. Sometimes you will walk up to a prickly pear cactus during a particular drought period and it'll look dead. Those pads that you see will actually be all wrinkled up. So think about when your fingers potentially you've been in the water too long and your fingers get all wrinkled up. It looks similar to that where the pads get all wrinkled up. But basically what happens with the prickly pear cactus is that so much water has been drawn out of those pads that they actually get wrinkled up from dehydration. But prickly pear cactus can live through this. They're extremely drought tolerant. Even though they look dead and dried out and almost completely non-existent anymore, as soon as water comes, they can suck that water back up, they fill those pads back up, and they spring back to life as soon as the rains come. So that's kind of an interesting little fact about prickly pear cactus. This is a desert agave. also sometimes called a century plant because they only bloom once in their life and then they die off. This is a leaf succulent, so you can see it has spiny leaves here, not much of a stem. The stem really close to the ground, but you have these spiny leaves. So this one is different, and it stores water in its leaves. The leaves, you can see the spines on the edges of the leaves, very, very spiny, and you can see the shape of those leaves, basically funneling water down into that plant. Once again, using CAM photosynthesis, most succulents have very shallow root systems, okay, because they need to have roots that are very shallow in order for them to suck up as much water as they can as soon as that water gets into the ground. So most succulents have shallow root systems. A lot of them also have a single taproot that goes down into the ground to kind of anchor them a little bit more. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the saguaro. But there is a very shallow root system and often very broad, spread out root system in order to draw any water that happens to fall on the ground into them. Let me go back for just a minute. I just want you to look at those, the leaf shape. Basically, it's basically those leaves are like a little funnel. So the agave, when it rains, the water just runs down those leaves and basically works like a little funnel and runs the water down into the center of that plant so that its roots don't have to be quite as quick with drawing up the water because it has these funnels that actually draw the water right to it. And a lot of succulents don't have that benefit. They have to draw up most of the water with their roots. So moving on to the saguaro. Saguaro only found in the Sonoran Desert, so very cool, endemic to the Sonoran Desert. Interestingly, I think it's kind of strange that when you see pictures of the desert, you think pictures of the desert in your mind, you always think of saguaro cactuses. Well, this happens to be the only desert in the world that has saguaro cactuses, so I think that that's kind of a misnomer in people's minds that you find cactuses like this in the desert because you only find them here in the Sonoran Desert. So very, very cool adapted plants though. They have roots, very, very shallow, broad root system. So you can see how tall this saguaro is in the picture here. I put in this picture because it has a human here who you can kind of give you a little bit of an idea of how tall this saguaro is. And the root system for a saguaro is as broad across as the plant is tall up. So very, very broad root system, very shallow root system because basically they are able to suck up this water through diffusion. And so in order for them to diffuse this water into their systems, they have very wet roots. There has to be a lot of water in the ground in order for diffusion to work down its concentration gradient to bring that water into those roots. So obviously, they have to do that very quickly because it doesn't rain that much very often. So they have lots and lots of roots out there that allows them to draw that water in very quickly. Particularly during those summer monsoons that we get, and then they draw in that water and they store it inside themselves. Saguaros also have a taproot, which is a single long root that goes straight down into the ground that often goes up to 2 feet underground. Often for succulents, if they have a taproot, often it is used to go down to the water table and have that one root that can get down to water underneath the ground. So when they're in super extreme drought and there's no water coming down on the surface, they sometimes can use that taproot to continue actually surviving through that drought. So the saguaro stores water in the stem, and at full hydration, mature saguaros can weigh 3,200 to 4,800 pounds. Pretty crazy, and I know saguaros that are planted as landscape plants, we had several in our neighborhood. When it rains really hard and for the extended period of time and there's a lot of water, we've actually had several saguaros in our neighborhood soak up so much water that a huge portion of their body actually just broke off because it sucked up so much water and got so heavy that it just collapsed. And then they had to actually cut down the saguaros in their landscaping. We actually had a giant saguaro in front of our house before we bought that house that had the same thing happen. We no longer have a saguaro in front of our house because a huge portion of it fell off, and then it was obviously a safety issue, and so they had to cut the rest of it down. So interesting, cactuses do get very, very heavy when they suck up water. We actually have a barrel cactus in front of our house that I think it was last summer we had a 4-day rain where it just kept raining. And that barrel cactus actually sucked up so much water that it tipped over because its root system was so shallow, and it actually tipped over. So I called the nursery and I said, what are we supposed to do about this plant? Is there any way that we can replant it? And he's like, oh yeah, well, you just have to go out and you stick a blanket underneath it so that the spines don't hurt you. You get the blanket underneath of it, and 2 of you can just pull on the sides of the blanket, stand it back up, and then you can put the roots back into the ground. Well, my husband and I went out and tried to do this, and we finally had to get a car jack and put it underneath the cactus and try to jack it up that way, because this thing ended up weighing like 800 pounds. It had sucked up so much water, and there was absolutely no way that we were doing it. We had to call in a landscape company to come in and do that for us because it was way too heavy. Interesting. Okay, so continuing with Saguaro Cactus, another adaptation that the Saguaro Cactus has, and several different succulents have this as well, but I wanted to point it out with the Saguaro, is it has these accordion folds in its skin. So it kind of looks like it's got bumps out, and those are actually sort of like sunscreen for the Saguaro. They protect the Saguaro from getting burned by the sun, so that less of the skin of the Saguaro is actually exposed to the heat of the sun. So that's kind of cool. The other thing that the accordion folds do is they can expand and contract as the saguaro brings water in. So it basically allows the saguaro to expand when it's got a lot of water in it, and then as the water goes out again, those accordion folds fold back again. So very, very cool. The saguaro has these really, really sharp spines on it as defense against predators, also reducing that sun exposure. As I said, it provides shade for the plant, also sort of like sunscreen, protecting that skin from the sun, and providing that climate control on the epidermal surfaces through the shade. So pretty cool. Saguaro also has that thick, waxy exterior coating, which reduces water loss in the saguaro. And saguaros, very, very tall, they can actually provide shade for themselves. So I threw in this picture of the shade provided by the shadow of the saguaro, and what happens during rainstorms when water gets down here, that shadow allows that rain to not evaporate as quickly. So if there are puddles at the bottom of the saguaro, the shadow keeps the sun from evaporating that water right away and allows the saguaro more time to be able to draw that water up into itself. No leaves and cam photosynthesis once again in the stem. So that's the Saguaro cactus. Next, talking about the fishhook barrel cactus, which may actually be what we have in our front yard. I'm not exactly sure, but it looks very similar to this. Also has the ribs. So the accordion-like folds that can expand and contract as it draws water into itself. It has 3 to 4 inch long fishhook-shaped spines. Really scary to me. Very long, very scary spines. And that protects it basically from herbivores that are in search of water. Barrel cactuses have vault-like water-storing bodies. They actually have the greatest volume to surface ratio possible because generally they are just in this big circle. So they have lots and lots of volume to surface area. So they are able to store more water in that volume than really any other cactus because of their shape. They can store nearly 20 pounds of water inside themselves. And interestingly, and this is the case in a lot of succulents, is that the water inside the plant can be toxic, have chemicals in it, things like that. So water inside these cactuses is actually not very drinkable. A lot of times it has toxic chemicals in it that you wouldn't be able to use as potential drinking water anyway. With barrel cactuses, you have oxalic acid in the water, and if you drink it, it can cause diarrhea if you have an empty stomach, so not really necessarily a good thing to do, although potentially if you were dying in the desert, it might be worth a try. But this is a protective mechanism, basically another mechanism to keep predators, herbivores, away from the cactuses. Many succulents have toxins in them. They also have a bitter taste, things like that, so that animals don't want to eat them. Next, we have the organ pipe cactus, which is a stem succulent. Okay, once again, no leaves. It is the second largest cactus next to the saguaro. The saguaro is the largest cactus in the Sonoran Desert. So the organ pipe cactus is the second, and you can see why it's called the organ pipe, because it's got a lot of different stems that come up here looking sort of like organ pipes. An interesting story about this, the saguaros use this too, but I thought I would talk about this here, is that many cacti need what we call nurse plants in order to germinate and grow during their seedling stages. And they actually germinate underneath a tree. We're going to talk about some of those trees next week. They germinate and grow their seedlings underneath a tree. That protects them from wind, protects them more from herbivores, protects them from the really super hot sun while they are growing up and becoming mature. And generally, once the cactus matures under this nurse plant, the cactus roots are able to then suck up all the water that comes, and often the nurse plant ends up dying. So kind of an interesting relationship. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to symbiotic relationships as well. And interestingly, on the organ pipe cactus, it has buds, so water or flower buds that open up, but its flower buds open up on different days so that it can actually extend its flowering period, so it has a greater chance of spreading its pollen to other areas to get fertilized and produce new seeds, because it can extend the period in which it has flowers blooming and therefore have a greater chance of having animals come and spread that pollen. So that's kind of an interesting adaptation for that plant. Next, we have the teddy bear or jumping cholla. It has thick fur-like spines. It really looks like it's furred, like a teddy bear. That's why they call it the teddy bear cholla. It's super, super thick spines. And those spines almost completely shade that stem from the heat of the sun. So really protecting that cactus from the heat of the sun. Also has light-colored stems, and the light-colored spines also reflect a lot of that sun's heat, so that's protecting from the heat of the sun. There are segments in this cactus that break off very easily. That's why they call it the jumping cholla, because if you rub against it, those spines may grab onto you and appear as if they jumped off the cactus onto you. They don't really, they just break off really easily. And this is how this cactus actually reproduces itself, is by just breaking off pieces of it and having those new pieces root into the ground. These segmented stems store water and photosynthesize through CAM photosynthesis. And then you can see those easily broken joints allow segments to be carried away by animals, wind, humans, etc. Most of the reproduction is done through this mechanism of propagation, where that piece breaks off and plants itself into the ground. So kind of an interesting plant. And that is the end of our succulent lecture. Next week we will be talking about trees and shrubs and annuals. So enjoy your hike this week. Hopefully you see lots of succulents. I know they're out there. Take lots and lots of pictures of any succulent that you see that looks different than something else you've seen, and I'm interested to see what you find out. So enjoy, and I will talk to you again soon.